BJ Counsel. I view the world through the lens of having been followed by a white clerk as a child while shopping in a five and dime. I'm a retired police executive and own UN50, which gives guidance on surviving interactions with police.
I'm Harmony Chavis, and I view the world through the lens of one of the most misunderstood and diverse generations in our nation's history. I'm a social worker and a believer of radical kindness and love as modalities of healing.
My name is Andrew Counsel. I view the world through the lens of a generational camera phone. I wake up as a black male and go to bed as a black male. I am surviving this never-ending court case we commonly call life in the best way I know how.
All right, thanks folks for joining us. This is UN50, and I'm glad to have you back for those of you that listen to us. And for those of you that may have joined us on June 18th for the Voices of Passion. Hopefully those that were there, what I told you there was that our panelists didn't get a chance to really go into detail, but what we're going to do a podcast and all the panelists will do a little bit more conversation about who they are. And so our guest today is going to be Ms. Anderson, Jeryl Anderson, who was on the panel. She's a telecommunicator. I'm going to let her just briefly tell you a little bit about her. You probably saw that information on the webinar that we had on June 18th. And so she'll give you a little bit of a recap of her. And then we're just going to kind of continue the conversation that we had on June 18th about education and getting out here and moving forward and helping move folks forward out of the system. As the webinar was about all Black women seeing that from each perch. For those of you that may not have seen that, we had a magistrate, a judge, a warden, a police officer, me, and then Ms. Anderson, who's a telecommunicator, and then we have had an executive director from a youth center. So, and we're all Black women who have a perspective as to what we see that's pushing Black and brown bodies into the system. So I want to thank Jeryl for joining me on the 18th and being on my panel and coming and taking a few minutes with us to kind of do a short follow. And also too, this is the second time Jeryl's been on my podcast. So if you want, you can also, we're going to kind of call this one part two. She was also on there just talking about telecommunicating and the job, which if you don't know how that works, she gives you really good insight onto how telecommunication 911, what that looks like, how it works, and how you need to, if you need help, what's the steps to do that. So listen to part one if you want to find out more about telecommunicator. She does that very well and it educates us all. I learned from that. But this time we're mainly just kind of talking about a follow-up from the webinar. So Jeryl, thanks again. So just tell a little bit about yourself.
Thank you for having me back. I currently work for Orange County Emergency Services, where I serve in the role of recruitment and outreach coordinator. I have been in public safety emergency communications for 30 years, and I'm currently working through Durham Tech with a new telecommunicator training program that will launch in May of this year. I have a passion as a telecommunicator for training, instruction, getting our staff trained and certified to serve the communities in their respective jurisdictions. And I'm happy to be back this evening to just continue our discussion.
And before we go on, the fact is that law enforcement is also recruiting really hard too. And I don't want to miss the fact that law enforcement is short-staffed and also 911 telecommunicator call takers. So when she kind of gets this thing up and running for those local in Durham and across the state, check out your community colleges, because this training is probably going to be coming, and they need staff. So as far as I'm concerned, I think I said it in the first podcast. She was the first responders are the 911 telecommunicators. You think it's law enforcement, it really is 911 telecommunicators. They get us there and they get it and they take care of us when we get there. So Jeryl, what do you think we were having this conversation about, from your perspective, being a Black female, because a lot of people don't really think about telecommunications being part of the system, because actually sometimes the entryway is through 911. Somebody's calling on somebody, especially when it comes to domestic violence and stuff like that. You unfortunately have to hear, you and your peers have to hear that. And I just kind of want to talk about, just as a Black woman, the conversation struggling with having to hear our community, sometimes listening to that and dealing with that. And if you have some opinion as how can we work away from some calling 911 sometimes?
So the first thing I'd like to say is to capitalize on what you said. There is a national shortage of telecommunicators across the country. So, and North Carolina is right in the middle of that. Of course, I see that every day as a recruiter. But one of the things I'd like to look at as we look at our Black communities and their relationship with 911 and emergency services, our white Americans in this country overuse a system due to privilege. They feel like they'll tell you quickly, I'm a taxpayer, you work for me, I pay your salary, and you are to help me. What we've seen is a disturbing trend in our Black communities, as if you watch the news and you see all the different things that are happening to people that look like you and I, at the hands of law enforcement, or the fact that they invited someone into their home and situation that they may not have, should have through 911, calling 911, is that more and more African Americans in Black communities are not calling 911 as much as they should.
Wow.
And that comes from a little research that I've done, but it's also a really good segue. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the 911 system, particularly for North Carolina. And the recent stat that I have is from 2020, but you can kind of take this information and I think you'll understand. In the state of North Carolina first, there are 115 primary public safety answering points, also known as PSAPs. Now, primary means that if you live in a place like Durham, North Carolina, or Hillsborough, North Carolina, or Raleigh, North Carolina, Charlotte, just to name a few, you probably, when you dial 911, will get answered by a primary PSAP, public safety answering point. We have 12 secondary public safety answering points across the state of North Carolina, and a secondary PSAP is just what it sounds like. They don't answer 911 first. An example of that would be the communication center on the campus of UNC Chapel Hill. They have their own communication center because they dispatch their own police department, but they are considered a secondary PSAP. And so what that means in dollars and cents is that their communication center cannot tap into some of the 911 funds that a primary public safety answering point or PSAP can tap into, because they are a bigger system, more staff, all of that. And I don't want to go down that rabbit hole because that's a whole different conversation, but I wanted to share that that's a total of 127 public safety answering points across the state of North Carolina, keeping in mind that we have 100 counties in our state.
Right. Okay.
All right. In 2020, in the state of North Carolina, all by itself, over 7 million calls were made to 911.
Wow.
Of those 7 million calls, 79% of them were made from a wireless phone. So that's a little like that's like a little over 5 million phone calls. 12.5% were made from a wireline. You know, most of us don't have a wireline phone in our home anymore.
Right.
That total of calls was a little over 898,000.
Okay.
And then 8.2% of those 7 million calls were made over what we call voice over IP. Those are the phones that if any of you that will listen to this podcast subscribe to Spectrum like I do for my internet service, they also will offer you as part of your package a VoIP phone line, voice over IP. Mm-hmm. So what that means is you don't really have to have, you don't have to pay the phone company to have a wire line. You can just plug a phone in. If you have a phone line, you can plug a phone in and it will work. But you must remember that it's a voice over IP, so that when you lose power, right, and your computer is out, so is your phone service. Right. So the argument can be made by many that you want to have a wireline phone, and people in a different generation, our parents, BJ, yes, have a wireline because they know that when the power goes out, the phone will still work. Mm-hmm. The rest of us are running around with our cell phones trying to find a battery pack to keep our
Yeah.
phones on
Yeah.
until the power comes back on, because I myself in my own private residence no longer have a wire line.
Right.
You know, me and my husband have cell phones. So I wanted to give you that information to talk, then kind of talk a little bit about how are people of color inviting, you know, the police and law enforcement into their homes and into their life and into their situations. The majority of the calls that, at least when I processed and then in the research that I've seen, it is still the same. Nothing has changed. When we invite law enforcement into our homes and into our private lives, when we have any type of dispute, particularly if it's domestic violence, that is the number one. We invite them into our homes and our situation when we have some sort of event that requires emergency medical services or EMS. Unfortunately, despite in the Black community, a lot of people don't have a doctor, even in 2022. And so they use the 911 system to call for an EMS unit for all of their aches and pains and ailments, whether it requires a transport or not.
Before you go on, I gotta say, that I am just love the stats. I love it.
Okay.
But I also, you know, when we talked about at the webinar, we were talking about the riots and the things that they found out what were causing the riots, the education, health, and one of them was healthcare.
Yes.
One of them was healthcare. So here we are. That our community they ain't got no doctor.
No, and they, you know, and
they're
it's not
calling
that
911 for EMS to get oh man, this is awesome. This
Yes.
is right what we were talking about, and I appreciate that. Go ahead.
So they call 911 for any type of ailment, any type of pain or whatever, you know, the situation is, because they simply do not have a doctor. They may not have insurance. They may not have transportation to get to the emergency room if they need that type of care, or to an outpatient facility that will see them. And so they use the system the best way they can to their advantage, and that's what they see. Now, the same portion that will call 911 for EMS, it should be noted, BJ, will also use the emergency room as their doctor's office.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've ever, I don't go to an emergency room. I'm going to have to be really sick or almost dead to go, because what I know, having worked in this business for over 30 years, is that I could go for something relatively serious and sit for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
Because the system, like anything else, is clogged up, just like they call and overpopulate the 911 lines in a communication center. They do the same thing at the emergency room and other things, because you can't tell that they can't tell the difference.
Right.
So let me segue for a minute to education. One of the things that I do in my job with Orange County Emergency Services is I'm also the outreach coordinator. So what that means is my face is the face that represents my agency as I go out among the community and teach people about 911, how to properly use the system, what a real and true emergency is,
Mm-hmm.
what number to dial if it's not an emergency, after I teach you what an emergency is, because we want to help everyone, and that's what we're there for. But to explain to them the importance of not clogging up the 911 lines with calls that are not emergency, keeping other people from getting into the center, thus slowing down the response, which costs lives and or loss of property. Did you have a question or comment?
Nope.
Okay, looks like you had one.
No, go ahead. I'm just absorbing.
The other type of calls that come in a lot, particularly from the Black community, are when we call to report on each other. So and so and such is over here at this location, and I know y'all got a warrant on them.
Okay.
Sound familiar?
Yeah, sounds familiar.
Yeah. I saw on the news that y'all wanted some information on that robbery that happened at such and such the other week. Well, I know who did it, and I want the reward money. And then you have to give them a different number, of course.
Right, gotta give them a different number. Yeah.
Right.
Number for that.
So all of these things, to me, have become an issue. And I'll go back to something that we talked about in the first podcast, because of the lack of public education on how to effectively use the system that is there for everybody. Now, I say that tongue in cheek because let's talk about the lack of education. Back when I was a child, and you too, BJ, before you ever thought about becoming a police officer, every police car that I ever saw had, in an emergency, dial 911.
Yep.
And you saw it on billboards, you heard it on the radio, you saw it on the police cars. And that's a great message to get people to understand that when you don't know what to do and it's an emergency, dial these 3 digits and somebody is trained, is going to help and send some help to you. That's a great thing. But if you don't ever follow through and teach people how to use the system, then we find ourselves where we are. So we get calls in the 911 center on everything that you can imagine. What time is it? What time does the parade start? Are the roads clear? My toilet is overflowing. I don't know what to do. You know, you name it. I have probably in 30 years just about heard it on a 911 call.
Wow.
You know, how many states are in the United States of America?
No.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. All of those things happen. And then when people with real and true emergencies, I mean, where somebody's having a cardiac event or respiratory difficulty or shot or stabbed.
Breaking in the house. Somebody
Right, or something's in
window.
progress, or something's on fire. Those people can't get in because you on the line asking these things or tying us up with calls that are not true emergencies. And again, I say that tongue in cheek because the people that work in a communication center are trained to what a true emergency is. And that perception, which is a reality, is different from what the public knows an emergency to be. For the public, anytime I can't figure it out, that's an emergency. That's an emergency because you told me in an emergency to dial 911.
Right.
So people that do the job that I do now, we have a big job. It's a big task. So I start with the children, teaching them about 911 and sending things home with them so they can teach their parents who don't know no better what 911 is really for.
Yeah.
All right. We're going in not just to African American or Black communities, but I'm trying to reach everyone because there's a misconception for everyone about really how the system works. The only people that don't seem to be overly not informed are white Americans, because I said earlier, they use the system, but they use it from a place of it's my right, a privilege to call these 3 numbers. And when I do, you work for me, I pay your salary, send me some help. And so in the Black or African American communities, the stance is, I want to call for help. This is the only number I know to call. But there's also an underlying fear that if I call, one, will you really come and help me? Or is this going to end badly for me? I'd rather not call.
Wow. 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 That's day and night. That's day and night. Wow. I thank you for that, because I'm just kind of sitting here in awe. I mean, I know we kind of had, we you know, that's kind of why we're doing this follow-up after the webinar, just to kind of take this thing a little deeper. Like you said, start in the schools and because that's just, I think for me, just going back to them, and you know, we probably will have, we're going to, you know, continue to talk about the webinar piece about the healthcare. I mean, I think for me, when we say something like healthcare is an issue, I mean, I think everybody knows that, but the fact that people got to understand that for Black folks, just like you said, 911 and getting EMS to some hurts. That's it, because I ain't got no doctor, I don't have no insurance. So this is it. This is it.
A lot of times when they come out, the EMS they'll say, well, we're not going to transport, and they'll have them sign that AMA form. So, you know, that because they use resources, you know, sometimes they'll do what they can for you. And then a lot of times that person will say, I don't want to be transported, even if it's against the, you know, if there's a paramedic EMT team on, and they say, we really need to transport you, you meet the criteria for whatever the issue is, they may say, that's all right, I'm okay, I'm all right. You know, because they know that they cannot afford it, They know what they have and what they don't have.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, so I don't know what else I just kind of wanted to make sure that folks, if they had wanted to get some more detail about who you are and what you do and your passion is definitely communications, telecommunications. You train folks, you're recruiting folks, and also you're educating people. And I hope, folks will take advantage of that and reaching out and look, because we'll have your contact information out there, um, just to be able to help educate folks. Because you're right. You can't. I can't believe somebody's going to call and ask them. I tell you, the toilet is running, or states and stuff like that, just clogging up the system, for folks that really need assistance and all that kind of stuff. And especially being right now in this moment, having a shortage of staffing, it's not a good thing. So, just before we go though, I want you to talk about real quick. You did, in case folks are like, well, I want y'all to know, in case you don't want to listen to her on the part one. I want you to talk about when dialing 911, because you talked about don't hang up. Can you explain as to why they should not hang up? Because I've heard of somebody recently say something about, well, I dialed 911, it rang and rang, so I hung up, and I was like, no, don't do that. So can you kind of explain that? Because in case folks may not go to hear part one, I'd like for them to know that, at least that part.
Sure. So anytime you have an emergency or you need some sort of assistance and you do dial 911, and right now, it's been in the news and everything. We know that particularly the Durham City Agency is grossly understaffed, and they're working diligently to fix that. So you may call 911 and it may ring longer than you think it should. What I would urge you to do is please don't hang up. If you hang up, what will happen is you have abandoned a line, and now you're putting more pressure on a communication center that is understaffed, because they still have to answer that line, find out that no one is there, then they must challenge that line, meaning they must call back and try to get someone on the line to find out if you did need assistance or still what you need, and get someone out there. Now, if you've hung up and now you calling on another line, you're going to still be frustrated, because remember, they've got to answer the first line you abandoned. And then if they don't get anybody, they've got to try to figure out where you are and send someone to make sure that you're all right. While meanwhile, you're on the other line and it's ringing while they're calling you back on the other line. So what I would like for you to do is, please, when you dial 911, even if it's a misdial, please don't hang up. Please stay on the line. When someone answers, if you didn't mean to dial 911, because it happens all the time when you're trying to get that area code in there, just politely say, I'm so sorry. You don't even have to say you're sorry. Just say, it's a misdial. I just didn't want to hang up on you. And you know what they'll say? They'll say, thank you so much for staying on the line. We appreciate it. And they'll confirm that you really don't need any service. And then they'll disconnect the line. And they'll be happy about the fact that they got to talk to someone, and you can go ahead and retry your call. It's really important, because it is usually a policy or a procedure mandate at every 911 center in the state that if they answer an abandoned 911, or as we call it, a 911 hang up, that they must challenge that line. They must try to get someone on that phone. If they have a viable address that they can dispatch to, then they must tie up a resource and send someone to that location to verify that all is well and no one needs service. So if I could also add, BJ, most communication centers in the state now have text to 911. And so what we ask you to do, okay, because that's another function of another way to answer a call in a center that is grossly understaffed. So what we're asking everyone to do is, if you can talk, please call. But if you're in a situation and you can't talk, then please text, and they will respond to you as quickly as they can. But do know that texting takes time. So if you can talk, please use your voice and stay on the line, answer their questions. Remember that while you're answering their questions, they're creating a call for service, and someone else in the room is going to get those units on the way. So be patient with that telecommunicator. They must ask the questions, that they must get the information. They need what we call the 5 W's. They need to know where you are, what's wrong, who's involved, when it happened, and if there's any weapons. And they're going to have to ask those questions in a certain order, because they are bound by protocols that they are certified in. But trust and believe that while you're answering those questions, someone else is in the room. As soon as they have enough to do a dispatch, which is what's wrong and where you are or where the problem is, they're going to make that dispatch while they stay on the line and try to get additional information that will help those responders serve you in the best way possible.
That's it. That's it. And I love the way you do that. It's very, very thorough, obviously, because you do this as your profession and you're just passionate about it. But I tell you, I just love that part about folks really always say, well, why do you always ask me no question? They just send somebody, and I even tell, I said, somebody right next to them is dispatching somebody too, but they need to ask those particular questions so they'll know. But all people, and I really appreciate, people just don't understand. They feel like I'm talking to you and you ain't sending nobody. And that's never the deal. That's never the deal. Somebody in the room is rolling folks to you, but they got to ask those questions because they need that. Because as police officers, I need to know, try to get as much information as you can, because I'm on the outside in the car. I'm asking the dispatchers sometimes some questions as well. Well, can you ask them this? Can you ask them that? So they're beyond her 5 W's. The person, the police officer that they're dispatching or the EMS they're dispatching might be pushing some questions back. Well, can you find out from the call like this? Can you find out from the call of that? So you might get some more questions, and that just lets you know we're on the way. So thank you very much for that. Because my hat's off to a telecom. I love a telecommunicator. I love a telecommunicator. Y'all first responders in my world, because y'all the best. Y'all the best. So anyway, so thanks for joining us again for part 2. And also I just want to thank you again also for being a part of the panel for the webinar that we did recently. So I appreciate everything you do. I appreciate everything you do for the community, the work that you do, and the passion that you do for us all. So thanks a lot. So any closing comments, and then we'll head on out of here.
Just remember to stay on the line. Give the telecommunicator all the information that they ask for so they can make the correct decision the first time of what help they need to send for you. They're your first line of defense, and we want to make sure we get the right help on the first initial dispatch so that everyone gets what they need.
Thanks, Jeryl. I appreciate it. And thanks, y'all, for joining us. And thank you for those of you that may have joined us on the 18th. And I appreciate it. And you and 50 here in Durham. And as always, stay safe, stay well. Peace.